This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Well, hello and welcome to another presentation from the Bob Hawke Ministerial Centre. I'm here with Troy Bramston. He is a prolific author, senior writer at The Australian. He's previously written biographies on Robert Menzies and Paul Keating, and now he's tackled the big one, Bob Hawke. Troy, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Tory. It's great to be here with you again. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And I should just introduce myself. I'm a journalist at The Guardian. The Guardian and The Australian coming together, Troy. It's a wonderful moment.
Should be doing it more often.
We should be doing it more often. I want to start at the end, if that's okay. Can you tell me about the last interview that you had with Bob Hawke? Because you had such a long history with him. You saw him over many years, but tell me what he was like the last time you spoke to him.
Yeah, look, I probably interviewed Bob Hawke about 20 times or so over about a 15-year period. As a journalist and as an author, and I've been working on this book for several years. A lot of research I did at the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library and around Australia and overseas, and of course I've been interviewing lots and lots of people. But the most important person to interview was, of course, Bob Hawke himself, and I'd done a series of interviews with him for the book. And the last sort of, I guess, scheduled interview took place just a few months before he died, and of course I didn't know that he was going to die, but I went to his house at Northbridge in Sydney, sat with him on the back balcony, which I guess became kind of legendary as to where Bob Hawke would be most days in those final years and final months. He loved being outside. He would do crossword puzzles. He'd smoke a cigar. He'd drink a strawberry milkshake. And I sat down to interview him, and this is early 2019. And I was a little bit shocked. He was very sort of emotional, very reflective. He liked talking again about his parents. He told me how much he loved Hazel Hawke and how much he loved Blanche Delpuget. He told me how emotional he was at meeting Paul Keating just a few months earlier to sort of try to resolve, I guess, any differences and to make sure that that relationship was on a happy level. And I sort of got a sense that he was fading. You know, he was a little bit shrunken. He was still sharp in the mind, but it was a little bit emotional for me as well, because I saw this great line of the man kind of slipping away. And I said to Bob, you know, how do you feel? How is your health? And he looked at me and he said, oh, mate, I'd be quite happy if I don't wake up tomorrow. And that was a very, very confronting thing to have said to me. And then when the interview finished, Tory, I went outside and sat in my car in front of Bob's house, and I sort of reflected on that for a few moments, and I thought, wow, this is very different to other interviews. And when he did die, I was actually in Adelaide a few months later, and like everyone, I was shocked, but also not shocked because you know, this great figure had departed, but I'd only seen him a few months earlier and had seen that he was ready and eager to go.
That's such a gut punch hearing that he was ready to go. I can picture him kind of tanned, the big silver mane, the cigar, soaking up the sun. That must have been really difficult. So let's rewind though, because one of the things I think that surprises me, shouldn't have surprised me, but does a bit about your book, is the complications of the man. Like there's something, I guess history blurs a lot of those complications out, but he really was a complicated man. Considering you'd been writing about him for years before you got to the biography, what was one of the things that surprised you about Bob Hawke?
Well, I guess he had, in the final sort of decades of his life, become this kind of larrikin celebrity superstar. You know, it's really what he was in the 1960s and 70s, where a lot of people loved Bob Hawke. He was seen as a bit of a man about town, a bit of a celebrity. He had that kind of golden aura about him, but it's not really the real Bob Hawke. And, you know, at his final press conference as Prime Minister after he lost the leadership of the Labor Party to Paul Keating, he said, I'm a dinky-die Australian. I'm like everybody else. But in fact, he's not like everybody else. He is deeply complex and a very sort of an interesting man to kind of grapple with and kind of try to understand, because there are a lot of contrasts and a lot of contradictions throughout his life. And so this book not only deals with, his typical life story, which we've all been accustomed to and know well, and including the ACTU years and the prime ministership, but also deals into his personal nature. And I subtitled the book Demons and Destiny because he did have this sense of destiny, that he was going to be a great figure in public life. He was going to do something big. He was going to make his mark. This is something that his parents told him as soon as he literally came blinking into the early morning light in South Australia in 1929. He was destined to do great things, but he was also a deeply flawed man. And so the book, in the book I write about the drinking and the womanizing, but also the sort of emotional outbursts. It'd be tears, it'd be temper. And these are things that were throughout his entire life, and sort of the struggle, particularly to contain this sort of emotions in him and these demons in terms of the drinking and the womanizing became very, very significant throughout his entire life. And and as a biographer, I look to those things to try to understand them, to unpack them, and explain how they impacted on his public life.
And we'll come back to the destiny as well, and the tears I'd like to talk to you some more about as well. But on the demons, you've obviously, you've published extracts and various stories in the Australian with this, I guess, salacious, don't mean that in a derogatory term. And I was really interested to think, one of the ways that I personally thought about it was, it's the larrikin thing, a bit of a pants man, ladies man, like to drink. But am I right from your book? I'm getting more the sense that this is a addiction problem. I mean, this is seriously something that he struggled with for a long time. And it come from the history of a family who were sort of teetotalers and did talk about drink as a demon. Did you see that as, I guess, something that plagued him, more of a health issue, an addiction issue than a moral issue for him?
Look, Bob would never have seen himself as having an addictive personality at all. But certainly Blanchard Puget backed up my sort of analysis that he did have an addictive personality. And I do write in the book that he was a highly functioning alcoholic. Now, his mother was actually a leader in the Christian temperance movement in South Australia in the 1920s and 1930s. And she enlisted both of her sons, Bob and Neil, into the Band of Hope, which was the youth wing of the Christian temperance movement. So Bob had drummed into him from a very young age that alcohol was the devil's work on earth. It was evil. It should be eradicated from society. And in fact, he didn't actually start drinking until his second year at the University of Western Australia. So, but from that moment on, he took a liking to the amber ale and, became addicted to it. And, right through the 1950s and 1960s and into the 70s in particular, he could be a loathsome, horrible, awful drunk. He would sometimes drink like 20 beers in a session. That was something that Bill Kelty, the former ACTU secretary, told me. Ralph Willis, later a minister who worked with Hawke at the ACTU, he said he could be a terrible drunk, lash out at people. But he didn't see it that way. He saw it as something that he liked to do. He enjoyed drinking. He thought he could give it up. And of course, the amazing thing about Bob is that a lot of people who saw him drinking to excess in the 60s and 70s, and, it became a badge of honour to say you'd had a drink with Bob Hawke at your local pub, is that he gave it up in 1980, just before he entered Parliament. And that shocked a lot of people, that he could have that discipline and that resolve. He didn't need Alcoholics Anonymous. He didn't need a support group. He just had those fires of ambition burning within him. He wanted to be Prime Minister, but he knew he had to give up the drinking. So he did, but he didn't give up the womanising.
And he was amazingly driven. You say, he came blinking into the light being told he was going to be Prime Minister. And then I guess talking about the temperance movement, you might picture an austere childhood, but it wasn't like that at all, was it? I was quite touched actually by your description of his early family life.
Yeah, look, it was a middle-class upbringing. He was the son of a clergyman, Clem Hawke, and the son of a school teacher, Ellie Hawke. He had a younger brother, Neil, who was some years older than him, and he died tragically in 1939 when Bob was just 9 years old. after contracting meningitis at a local swimming pool in Adelaide. So this sort of parental love intensified for Bob. And so this sort of fueled this sense that he was special. He did have a spoiled childhood, but it was pretty much a middle-class childhood, very connected with the church and the local community. He didn't want for anything. He had been born just on the brink of the Great Depression, and certainly experienced what many people were feeling, saw unemployed people, saw people coming to the Hawke house asking for a meal, asking for financial help, but he didn't really suffer that himself. But it was a very typical sort of middle-class upbringing, first in Bordertown in South Australia, and then the family moved to the Yorke Peninsula, and then to Western Australia, where he continued his schooling and went to university. So it was a very happy, very loving, very supportive childhood. He loved his parents immensely. We talked about that final interview, Tory, and I say that he did actually talk about his parents. That was a thing that at the end of his life, he became so animated about, so filled with love and joy, talking to me again for the millionth time about his parents. So this sort of feeling of being showered with love and devotion carried through him his entire life, and I think gave him a kind of an inner confidence that was with him at all those stages, whether it was the ups or the downs.
And it feels as though that nurturing environment, and then his academic progression, and then the power that he got when he was in the ACTU, all of this was driving towards the prime ministership. But he did balk a little bit for a while, didn't he, before he took the leap into, well, not that ACTU isn't politics, but he took the leap into getting elected.
Yeah, look, he had won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, which he commenced in 1953, and he studied the industrial relations system in Australia, and he came back to Australia and thought, look, this is where I want to devote my talents, and he imagined himself really as an academic, and he started a PhD at ANU, and he got into a position where he was asked to advise the ACTU on a couple of wage cases, and he enjoyed it. He enjoyed it immensely. He enjoyed the camaraderie of trade union people. He felt an affinity with their struggle for better working conditions and better wages. He loved that environment. He loved the work. So he was a very famous advocate in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, and then, of course, became ACTU president beginning on the 1st of January 1970, a position he held for more than a decade. And it was described as the second most powerful man in Australia. I mean, it's extraordinary. Here's Bob Hawke as ACTU president in the 1970s. More people knew him, some polls suggested, than the Prime Minister. So he was always on TV, always on radio, in the newspapers. He was involved in a titanic struggle to improve the lot of working men and women. And he was a big contributor to local and international policy debates. He gave sharp criticisms of the Whitlam government and the Fraser government. So he was everywhere, and he loved it, and he had power. He really did have power, and he had influence, and he was very reluctant to give that up, even though he did think, I would like to go into Parliament and be Prime Minister one day. So it was a real struggle, and there are many, many opportunities he had to go into Parliament, but he waited until 1980.
And do you think he got that extremely prominent position within the ACTU because of the Times? Because obviously, people wanted to hear about his ideas on basic wages and so on. Was it that, or was it just that he was such a charismatic guy, or a combination of those two things?
Yeah, look, I think it's a combination, Tory. I mean, about 50% of Australian workers were members of trade unions, so they had enormous influence and authority and power within the economic framework within Australia. But the ACTU was a pretty small show when Bob Hawke took over. There was only about maybe 4 or 5 people that actually worked there. It didn't have a big profile. A lot of the power resided in regional or state labour councils. And so he transformed that and gave the trade union movement a national voice. And the trade union movement had never seen a more dynamic, more exciting, more thrilling political figure at the helm. And so he did see industrial relations as inexorably linked with politics and with economics. And so he was a big contributor. He would appear on television, and it was like a a board being clacked on a soundstage when Bob Hawke appeared in front of a camera. He was a supreme performer. You know, he could turn on the charm, he could be indignant, he could be angry, he could be funny, he could be passionate, compassionate, he could do anything. And Australians tuned in and they were mesmerised by Hawke and his power. There was no more popular figure in the 1970s than Bob Hawke nationally, and it was extraordinary to watch. And he became a hero to working men and women. But, you know, he wasn't really tribal. So he wasn't tribal in a political sense because his central mission in life was to bring people together. He preached consensus politics. He tried to talk Malcolm Fraser into doing some kind of accord in the 1970s or holding an economic summit. And Fraser didn't want to hear those ideas. But when Hawke became Prime Minister, there are two things he did, you know, within the first few months of being in office. So he was a conciliator, he was a uniter, he wanted to bring people together, and that had appeal, I guess, around Australia.
It's interesting because, again, you know, my preconceptions and maybe other people's is, you know, you think of him, again, the larrikin, you know, he's having a good time, it's a little chaotic, so on. But you're right that actually his governing style was excellent. I mean, he was actually running a good government. So on top of being, I guess, charismatic, then the larrikin thing, but there was some solid work underpinning his time.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I mean, the Hawke government, you know, elected in 1983, did trade on Hawke's popularity. There's no doubt about that. He's the most popular figure in the country. You know, I was amazed to find that in 1984, he had a 78% approval rating. Now, no Prime Minister since or before that has come within cooee of that figure, as you know. But, you know, popularity can only get you so far. And so Hawke had to understand how to master the machinery of government. He had to learn the art of governing. And he'd been on the ACTU executive, of course. He chaired those executive meetings. He had been on the Reserve Bank Board. So he had an idea about administration and governance. But even his cabinet colleagues were surprised at how effective he was as a chairman of the board. And when I interviewed Paul Keating for the book, he described himself as kind of the government's managing director. And so he was a very effective chairman of cabinet. He allowed ministers to run their portfolios, would only intervene when there was a significant issue that affected the entire government or he had a personal interest. He was someone who listened to frank and fearless advice from public servants. He didn't remove public servants from their positions when he came to power. He wanted his staff, again, to be frank and fearless with their advice. He appointed career public servants to run his office, and he paid close attention to the administration of government. You know, he could effectively develop, articulate and implement policy. And it sounds easy, but it wasn't. And the other point to quickly make, Tory, is that he was very good at managing a group of people. You know, he managed the Labor Party through a period of profound change in the 1980s, and he also managed that cabinet. You know, the people around that cabinet table in the first few terms of the government are amazing. People like John Budden and people like Don Grimes and Bill Hayden, Paul Keating, Lionel Bowen, Susan Ryan. You know, these were big Titanic figures. Peter Walsh, Mick Young. I mean, they're big figures in their own right, but Hawke was able to work with them and harness that talent to produce significant policy outcomes.
And then, of course, there's Keating, another Titanic figure. And I always think of them as, you know, there being a lot of animosity in that relationship, but actually they shook hands, they talked, they were quite friendly when I think people still saw them as very kind of opposite each other.
Yeah, look, they were personal friends. There's no denying that. I mean, you know, Paul Keating and Anita Keating and their three children would often or four children would often go to the lodge on weekends for barbecues in the early years of the Hawke government. You know, at the end of the day, Hawke would press a buzzer to the office directly below his in Old Parliament House and call Keating up to have a cigar at the end of the day. So they were personal friends. And they were largely united on the policy direction of the government. They both believed in the economic reforms that had to be made. They both believed in the sort of political pragmatism, and I guess gradualism was a term that Hawke had used in sort of running a government, and effective communication. But they did have disagreements, there's no doubt about that. But they were largely minimal over a 9-year partnership. And of course, that relationship did explode over the leadership in the sort of 1990, 1991 period. So it doesn't need to be sort of minimised, the differences, but we sometimes forget how cooperative and effective they were as a political duo.
It's not such a good look for a treasurer to have a cigar these days.
No.
Maybe we can talk a bit about, I guess, the things that Hawke did and who he was that maybe would be a lot more difficult today. So the emotion, I think, is fascinating. I feel as though it's still a lot of male politicians would not feel comfortable crying in public, but we're talking back when, you know, blokes were even more kind of blokey. How do you think that played for him? Is it because he was seen as authentic that he could get away with these kind of emotional excesses?
I think that's right. Look, Bob Hawke never pretended to be someone that he wasn't. There's nothing fake about Bob Hawke. There's nothing contrived. There was nothing hidden back. I mean, he was, as we've said, you know, someone who struggled with alcohol, he struggled with womanising, and he did have affairs while he was Prime Minister. But he did have these extraordinary emotions that they could be tears streaming down his face. He could be tearing strips off a journalist if he didn't like the line of questioning. We can all have the images flashing through our mind of Richard Carlton, even in 1983, on the day Hawke won the Labor leadership, and he said, "You've got blood on your hands for taking the job from Bill Hayden," and he tore into Richard Carlton. So, you know, this was the Hawke personality, and he was authentic. He didn't try to contrive it. And a number of journalists over the years had actually asked him about these emotions, and he said, "Look, I am an emotional person. I can't control it. Sometimes they just come out. It's who I am." But the tears were something that was pretty extraordinary in a very masculine, I guess, industrial political world in the 70s and 1980s. It is extraordinary, and there's a number of occasions where he cried about his parents, he cried about his children, he cried about his love for Israel. A lot of Australians might remember after the Tiananmen Square massacre, he cried at a public memorial service in 1989. The tears literally streamed down his face, and he never apologised for it. He said, "That's who I am." And I think Australians admired that he didn't actually pretend to be someone that he wasn't. He was authentic, and that I think gave him credibility.
Do you see a lot of, this is a question without notice, Troy, do you see a lot of authenticity today? I'm really struggling to think of anyone who has that kind of it's not unpolished, unpracticed, unrehearsed immediacy when they interact with the public or the media.
I think a lot of politicians are risk averse. I think they are careful in their public presentations. They are somewhat fearful. You know, they're very they sort of gingerly kind of dance around issues like, do you want to be Prime Minister one day? I mean, in the last few months, you know, I've interviewed Josh Frydenberg and Peter Dutton and asked them both, do you want to be Prime Minister? And they're sort of, you know, very careful about answering that question, but they got to the line and said they do one day with a whole lot of qualifications. But, you know, right through the 1970s, Bob Hawke said all the time he wanted to be Prime Minister. When he went into Parliament, he said he wanted to be Labor leader. He wanted to take the job from Bill Hayden, and he was just honest about that. And I think people appreciated that. And, you know, a lot of people have said, oh, Barnaby Joyce is someone who's got credibility these days or authenticity. But you know, Barnaby had a few secrets in his background, which we've come to learn in recent years. And Bob really didn't have many secrets, if any at all. I mean, everyone kind of accepted who he was. You know, I was amazed, Tory, to find that in the mid-1980s, he went on Clyde Robertson's News World television program, and he admitted his infidelity to Hazel Hawke as Prime Minister. And he cried about it and got very emotional. And then I was wondering, you know, what was the public impact of that? And of course, everyone was talking about it on radio. It was in all the newspapers the next day. And the next round of opinion polls that came out, they went up. His approval rating went up. So voters, I think, appreciated the fact of his honesty. And, you know, that's something I guess the politicians today could learn.
Let's get back to that infidelity and how these things would play out today, you know, Me Too and Time's Up and so on. Imagine Bob Hawke being born, what, 30, 40 years later, even being told he was going to be Prime Minister and still having that nurturing family life. What do you think would happen if he tried to enter politics later?
Look, I don't think Bob Hawke could be Prime Minister today if he acted the way he did back then. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. You know, our public standards have changed in terms of what we expect from politicians. I think the media has changed. An important point is that a lot of the press gallery in the 1970s and 1980s was male-dominated. And so that's not the only factor, but that is a factor. I think the media standards have changed as well. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think that we do expect more from our politicians. And, you know, Bob did have this kind of struggle to contain his sexual appetite. And there's a lot of aspects of this book that are going to shock and surprise people. But as a biographer, I had a responsibility to explore this fully. And, you know, it goes back to even in the early 1950s, I got access to letters that Bob had written to Hazel Hawke when they were, or Hazel Masterson, as she was then, when they were engaged. And he's at Oxford and she's in Western Australia. And he's writing to her about how he's struggling to tame his sexual desires because he's given opportunities to bed women at Oxford. So it goes back to a very, very young age and it continues right throughout his prime ministership. And I've been able to interview a number of women that had relationships with Bob and their story is told in the book. But you know, we have a different standard today and Bob was able to give up the drinking. So could he give up the womanising? Maybe he could. I don't know. It's a kind of an open question, but with, you know, cameras on mobile phones, different standards in the media, different standards from citizens, social media, he couldn't act like he did back then. And so a lot of this is going to surprise people, but it is the real Bob Hawke. It is who he is. It's a story about the complete man. And I do use the term sexual addiction in the book. It's a term that's been developed by the World Health Organization known as compulsive sexual behaviour disorder. And Blanchdale Puget, his second wife, backed up that analysis. So this is going to be confronting for people, but, you know, it's a book about the real Bob Hawke.
And in the end, I read you as coming down on the side of respect for a complicated man.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's a couple of other points to add to that, Tory. One is that he was a great champion of women's equality and opportunity. You know, in 1970, he supported equal pay for women. As Prime Minister, he also supported a maternity leave test case in the Industrial Relations Tribunal. He enacted the Sex Discrimination Act. He, you know, tripled childcare places. He expanded women's education. So he was a great advocate for women. And when I interviewed Susan Ryan, you know, the only female cabinet minister for much of the period, she said to me there was no better supporter around the cabinet table for women's equality and opportunity than Bob Hawke. So there are complexities to this. And the other point to make, which is really important, I think, Tory, is that Bob never pretended to be someone else. I've made that point in this event, and it is important because he didn't pretend to be a Christian values campaigning politician. He never said he was a great father. He never said he was a great husband. He was open, in fact, about his flaws and his faults, and that in many ways gave me license to write about it. And indeed, I talked to Bob about these things. And in that final interview you mentioned, he said to me that he wasn't a great husband and he wasn't a great father. And I asked why. And he said it was because of the infidelity. So Bob has given us, I guess, license to talk about this complex personality. And at the end of the day, his policy and political legacy and his industrial legacy is vast. And I don't think it is diminished by these flaws in his personal behaviour.
No, I found it fascinating that he could call himself a male chauvinist. Like, use that phrase, but then also you see his, you know, behaviour on both sides. I guess the infidelity and the womanising, as well as the pushing of women's rights. Look, I want to go to a really specific story because I hadn't heard this before. What happened with Frank Sinatra?
Yeah, Frank Sinatra. It's a great story. I think it's 1974. So Frank Sinatra comes to Australia on a tour, and he gets into a scuffle with the media pack, and he refers to female journalists as the hookers of the press. And so he was set upon. He was besieged by industrial action for making those outrageous comments. He had to cancel a concert in Melbourne. His Gulfstream jet was grounded, so he had to escape to Sydney on a general commercial service, and then was holed up in the Boulevard Hotel, and he couldn't leave. He thought about contacting Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union to get him out of Australia. He thought about contacting the US Navy to come and rescue him. It had been made clear that unless he apologised to female journalists, he would not be able to leave Australia, let alone perform any concerts. He actually got on the phone to Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, and Whitlam said to him, "There's only one man that can help you, and that's Bob Hawke." And of course, Hawke did go to the Boulevard Hotel to do a series of negotiations, and they eventually kind of worked it out. But Sinatra didn't apologise. He just expressed regret. His manager, Mickey Rudin, told Hawke that Mr. Sinatra has never apologised to anyone in his life, and he's not going to do it now. And when Sinatra got back to the United States, he was asked, what happened in Australia, and he said, "I made one mistake, and that was getting off the plane." And so this became an enormous international incident, about keeping Frank Sinatra under siege and sort of trapping him in Australia until he apologised.
The Novak Djokovic story of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was amazing, Tory, was to go through Bob Hawke's papers and find a letter that had been sent to him many, many years later when he just became Prime Minister from Mickey Rudin, Sinatra's manager, saying that, we think that this was such a big incident that we gave you a bit of an assist on your pathway to the Prime Ministership. And we want to kind of take some credit for this. And maybe you could do the right thing as Prime Minister and invite Mr. Sinatra back to Australia, because he hadn't been back since 1974. And he could do a few concerts and it'd be great. Now, there's no evidence that Hawke replied to this letter, and I was sort of curious about that. And as I'm reading through it, I get to the bottom of the letter and there's a PS at the bottom of the letter, and Mickey Rudin wrote, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Sinatra still thinks that women are the hookers of the press." It's just an appalling misunderstanding of these issues, tone deaf. And so Hawke obviously, would have just had no interest in supporting Sinatra at all, or apologising or welcoming him back to Australia. But Hawke loved to tell me those stories, and he told me he had quite a few drinking sessions with Sinatra and his manager in that hotel room over many, many hours.
I love that story. And look, there's another one, just while we're on the lighter side of Hawke maybe, which I think I heard you talking about on the radio, but it isn't actually in the book. Considering it's just been Shane Warne's memorial, Shane Warne and Bob Hawke also shared some special times, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In the 1970s, Bob Hawke's celebrity status cut nothing at home. I mean, it wasn't worth anything. Hazel needed a lot of help around the house. She'd ask Bob to help, put the washing on or do the washing up. He was not interested in anything like that. He couldn't even use the stove. He was pretty hopeless around the house. So Hazel asked Bridget Warne to come in and help her clean the house a few days a week. And she did that, and she often brought her two sons, Shane and Jason Warne. And as young kids, they played with the Hawke kids. And Bob Hawke told me he even gave Shane a few bowling tips on the family tennis court out the back as a very, very young man. So there's a great connection there, which is not widely known, between Shane Warne and Bob Hawke, both in many ways very similar kind of personalities, both kind of larger-than-life figures, flawed but open about their flaws, and people who touched Australians greatly. And a lot of people may have seen Shane Warne talk about Bob Hawke being Australia's greatest Prime Minister, and I think the fact that he knew him as a young boy probably had something to do with it.
Indeed. All right, we'll get back to some media stuff. What would you see as Bob Hawke's legacy? I was trying to think of what people remember, and I almost feel as though his personality in some way trumps his policy in terms of what people retain about him. So how did he make Australia a different place?
I think we became more prosperous, more equal, more fairer, more compassionate, more respected overseas, a more united country, proud of our country. I mean, Bob Hawke did bring Australians together. That's the first thing to say. He did have a visceral connection with everyday Australians. He loved Australians. They loved him. We've never had a Prime Minister more popular. He led Labor to 4 election victories in a row, something that hasn't been repeated since. But his policy legacy is significant. Of course, the two things are inexorably linked because he used his popularity and his rapport with Australians to achieve a series of landmark reforms. You know, the social policy reforms, I think a lot of them we probably take for granted. The Sex Discrimination Act we've talked about, the creation of Medicare, the massive tripling of high school completion rates, that's kids doing years 11 and 12, the big investment in universities or trades education, the HIV/AIDS response. So these things are all critically important. The economic reforms, we all know well, they are legendary. They are the basis of our modern prosperous economy, whether it's the float of the dollar, the dismantling of the tariff wall, the Accord framework, superannuation, the first budget surpluses since the 1950s. And the flip side of that, of course, is there was a recession in 1990, which was repeated globally. And that is a blemish, I guess, on the Hawke government's economic record. But those reforms did pay a dividend in the decades later. And environmentally, a lot of people look at things like saving the Franklin River in Tasmania or Daintree or the Kakadu. When I interviewed Bob Brown, Australia's leading environmentalist, he said Hawke was the environmental champion Prime Minister. It's a term he used. No government has done more to protect our environment. And Bob Hawke wanted to be remembered as someone who played a role on the international stage. And I was able to interview some of his contemporaries, people like George Bush Sr., John Major, Brian Mulroney, the Canadian Prime Minister, and they respected Hawke as a Cold War leader who understood the big challenges between the East and the West, and was able to cooperate with them and play a big role. And he did play a personal role in ending apartheid in South Africa by working through CHOGM, or helping to end mining in Antarctica, or setting up the APEC Trade Forum. So, that's a laundry list, I guess, of achievements, but they are enormous, they're lasting, and we've benefited from them. So all of this is linked to the Hawke personality, running that very, very talented group of ministers, and his popularity and his rapport with the Australian people. But the legacy is vast, and I actually don't think there is a post-war Prime Minister who could say they achieved more than Bob Hawke.
And maybe putting aside no child shall live in poverty, did you talk to him about things that he wished he'd done or like policy regrets that he had?
Well, look, that actually was one of them, Tory. I mean, he did regret making that statement. He kind of truncated the promise. And that pledge, which he made in 1987, did actually lead to significant reductions in child poverty because he introduced what was known as the Family Allowance Supplement. He better targeted welfare payments to those in need. He supported single mothers. He made sure that, payments for divorced parents were being made properly and collected. So he did a lot of things. And ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Services, say that the Hawke government did more than any other to actually reduce child and family poverty. So that's a significant achievement, but he did regret those words. Of course, he regretted the recession in 1990, and that did cause a lot of hardship for people who lost their jobs or lost their businesses. And they did misread some of the signs in the economy, and they were led by Treasury and the Reserve Bank, but that's a poor excuse, I guess, for presiding over a recession. The other big thing he talked to me about, Tory, was Aboriginal land rights. And I'm very critical of Hawke on this point because there was an expectation and a promise made by the Hawke government that they would implement a national land rights scheme where Indigenous communities could claim Crown land and be paid compensation. And it was under pressure from Brian Burke's West Australian government that Hawke reneged on that promise and didn't actually follow through in implementing a national regime. And a number of the ministers I spoke to judged Hawke very harshly for that. And I just think that he had such immense talent as someone who could communicate complex policy ideas and get people to agree that he could have done something on land rights, but he took the I guess, the political route and thought this was too difficult and decided to leave that for another day. And of course, an Aboriginal land rights scheme became one of the big achievements of the Keating government, his successor.
Yeah. And if I can take you back to his environmental credentials, you also write that he named climate change as one of the biggest challenges of our time. How do you think politics in general, it's extraordinary to me that it was probably, global warming was probably first brought to parliamentarians' attention while Bob Hawke was in power all the time back then. Did you see him do anything on that while he had the power?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. It's very, very, early days in terms of public awareness and government awareness of what was then known as global warming. And, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there were a number of cabinet discussions about climate change. And the Hawke government did give a commitment to study climate change, to work with international partners and to take action. But they were cautious steps. And whilst they recognised them and saw no doubt that this is an issue that's real and an issue that had to be addressed, they were cautious about it. And I guess the international community was cautious about it as well. And there are a number of cabinet documents where they say, we should take action, but be mindful of our trading relationship or, our mining exports and things like that. So it's early days for the Hawke government in terms of climate change, but there is a commitment to action, and they had done that on a number of things. Also, you might remember the big issue of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and the ozone layer, which was an issue that the international community worked to phase out CFCs in things like aerosols, and that was international action that was taken. And so the government actually did look at it in that way, which was an international solution was the best pathway forward to work cooperatively with other nations. And so it is a credit to the Hawke government that it is really the first government to take any action at all on climate change.
Indeed. And I want to take you back to your process, because when you were talking about Frank Sinatra, I was just thinking of how it must have felt to find that letter. Did you have other real eureka aha moments while you were digging through all that archival material?
I must praise the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library and the Bob Hawke Centre there in Adelaide, because I spent a lot of time at the library going through Hawke's papers. I was also given access to Hawke's papers in his Sydney office, which have now since been transferred to Adelaide. But, it's like stepping into a time machine and being transported to the past. I love sitting in archives, and I did it all around the world for this book, looking at documents, looking at letters, meeting records, diaries. I mean, there are so many things. So, some of the things in relation to Bob that I found really fascinating was, his father wrote a memoir that had never been published before, and it was just part of Bob's papers. It was written about 1980, and that gave me a really good insight into his early family life and also his parents, Clem and Ellie, of course. And there are other things too, 2 diaries that are there in Adelaide that Bob kept. One was when he went to India in 1952 for a Christian student conference, and he lost the faith in India. He was a very committed Christian, but he was appalled by widespread poverty, and he couldn't explain it, he couldn't rationalise it. And so that began his departure with organised religion, and he writes about that in his diary, in his handwritten, cramped scrawl. And there's another diary from a year later, Tory, when he's on his way to Oxford. And in that diary, he's on a ship, of course, and he's stopping off at various ports, and he stops off in Cape Town, South Africa. And this is 1953, and he witnesses with his own eyes the brutality of the apartheid regime. And there on the page in Bob's writing is the phrase or the sentence, "There will one day be a day of reckoning." And then it's amazing to think, 30 years later, fast forward, and he's one of the leaders globally to end apartheid in South Africa. So as a historian, as a biographer, they are kind of eureka moments. And you're sitting in an archive with all these documents and you just go, wow, this is amazing. And, I think I estimated that I looked at probably about 1 million pages of archival documents. And it can be exhausting. It can be, time consuming, but the rewards are there. And I hope that people see that in the book and find that it tells them something new.
Yeah, and I think the losing his religion thing is really interesting, because while he was no longer religious, he did feel something. This is the destiny. How did he explain what he saw as, I guess, kind of a propelling force pushing him towards power?
Yeah, so his parents subscribed to the notion that there was some kind of divine intervention, particularly his mother. But Bob sort of downplayed that kind of religious element in his life. He didn't sort of see the hand of God sort of shepherding him around in his life. But he did tell me that he felt some kind of guidance. Now, guidance is a word that he used. And it's pretty interesting that he felt that there was someone kind of looking over his shoulder in his life, pointing him in the right direction. And that's pretty extraordinary. Now, Bob was an agnostic. He didn't believe or disbelieve, but he did feel this. And one of the sort of seminal moments in his life was when he was at university in 1947. He was riding a British Panther motorbike in Perth, and he crashed and he nearly died. And he was on the critical ill list for about a week or so. And he saw his life flashing between death or living. And he felt at that moment he had to change and refocus and dedicate himself, work harder. And he did that. And so he saw that as a critical turning point. And I guess that's an element of the kind of guidance that he did see in his life.
Troy, I feel like you've done a stonking job, 1 million pages condensed into this. It is jam-packed, and I feel like we could talk for hours about everything that's in there. But I might kind of start wrapping things up by just asking you to cast forward. We are rapidly heading into an election campaign with unpopular leaders. Well, I mean, everyone's unpopular in relation to Bob Hawke. What sorts of things do you think we've talked about what wouldn't have worked in politics today, but what do you think our current leaders could learn from Hawke?
Well, I think Hawke was always authentic. He always believed in the national interest rather than party or political interest. I think that's an important term. You know, if you were an advisor to Bob Hawke and you walked into his prime ministerial office and said, we should do X, Y, Z because it might help us win an election, he would have paid very little attention to that. And he thought that good policy was good politics. And I think that has been somewhat lost from our politics. I think politicians on both sides are a little bit risk averse. And, they're not prepared to take those kind of risks that we need to make the big leaps forward in a policy sense, whether it is on issues like climate change or economic reform or, the other aspects, social policy, environmental policy. There are a lot of things we can do. I think we've been a little bit limited in our vision from both major parties who are not wanting to sort of scare voters, not prepared to take those risks. Bob Hawke and Paul Keating made some pretty challenging, pretty difficult decisions that asked Australians to trust them because there would be an economic or a social dividend down the track. And they did that on time and time again with many, many policy issues. And so I think I'd like to see a little bit more bravery, a little bit more courage from our political leaders. And I think a little bit more honesty as well about who they are, what they stand for, their flaws and their faults, as well as their virtues and their attributes. So, politicians can learn a lot. And getting back to something you mentioned earlier, Tory, as well, is how to run a government. I mean, it looks easy, but we've had many, many recent prime ministers that have struggled with the art of politics and the art of governing. So understanding how Hawke ran a cabinet, worked with the public service, managed his office, communicated with voters, all these things are things that any prime minister can learn. And in fact, I interviewed all the prime ministers after Hawke for the book, and they all praised him very, very highly. But I also asked Hawke about them, and he was less flattering about them than they were about him. So he didn't think that many prime ministers have learnt those lessons. But he was always an optimist, Bob, and always confident in Australia's future. So hopefully we will get back to a position in the future where we are governed, I think, a little bit better than we are today.
Well, I think that's a brilliant note to end on, Troy Bramston. Congratulations on your book, Bob Hawke, Demons and Destiny. And thanks to the Hawke Centre, of course, without which tonight wouldn't have been possible, but also the entire book probably wouldn't have been possible.
Well, thanks very much, Tory. Thanks to the Bob Hawke Centre, the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Library, which played a big role in me writing this book and researching this book. thanks for this opportunity, and thanks to you too. It's great to see you and to talk to you again about yet another book, and I really appreciate that.
I look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Tory.